We were supposed to be their friends. Instead, they ate the ambassador. That was the moment everything changed. The delegation had been sent with open hands. Universal translators humming and diplomatic gifts. In tow the Galish, a towering race of insectoid creatures, had invited humanity to parley, claiming they sought peace. We believed them. Earth had suffered through its own history of war, and after decades of internal strife, we hoped that peace among the stars was possible. Then, on a live interstellar broadcast, the Galish feasted on Ambassador Halverson before he even got to deliver his speech. They didn't just kill him, they stripped his bones clean, cracked them open, and drank the marrow in front of the horrified human delegation. The Galish didn't see it as an act of war. To them, it was customary to consume the representatives of lesser species to absorb their knowledge, a sign of respect and dominion. They thought humanity would submit, accept the hierarchy of the stars, and fall in line. Like the dozens of other species they had conquered, they were wrong. Admiral Nathan Carter received the footage of Mir 6 minutes later, transmitted directly from the embassy's emergency beacon. Before it was obliterated, he had been in orbit above the Galish homeworld, awaiting confirmation that the talks had gone well. Instead, he watched in silence as his friend and mentor was torn apart by clicking mandibles and razor-sharp forelimbs. The admiral shut off the screen and gave the order. Every ship in the fleet had been fitted with weapons deemed unnecessary for a diplomatic mission. Humanity had come in good faith, but Earth's history of betrayal had taught us a hard lesson: always have a backup plan. The Galish had given us no choice. Across the fleet, missile silos opened, energy cannons hummed to life, and rail guns locked onto targets. The planetary defenses of the Galish, designed to intimidate weaker species into submission, were little more than an afterthought to the warships of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. The first barrage wiped out their orbital stations. The second shattered their planetary shields. The Galish had fought countless wars, but they had never fought humanity. They'd expected a drawn-out campaign, ground battles, political maneuvering, and slow concessions. What they got was a military doctrine crafted from centuries of human warfare, distilled into one brutal principle: overwhelming force. The bombardment was relentless. Cities turned to ash, biodomes ruptured, spilling their carefully engineered ecosystems into the burning sky. The Galish military, accustomed to fighting opponents who relied on primitive projectile weapons, were helpless against kinetic strikes. Traveling at Mach 20, then came the drop. Pods, thousands of them, streaked through the atmosphere like falling stars. Inside each one was a soldier armed and prepared to remind the Galish why humanity had clawed its way to dominance. On Earth, the Galish were larger, faster, and heavily armored, but they lacked one key trait humans possessed in excess: rage. The first wave landed in the ruins of their capital city. Marine Corps Captain Alias Grant stepped out of his pod, plasma rifle at the ready. His boots crunched against the remains of what had once been the Galish Grand Palace. Bodies scattered, some still twitching from the bombardment. In the distance, gunships screamed overhead, unloading payloads into whatever resistance remained. The transmission from Admiral Carter crackled in his earpiece: no negotiations, no prisoners, wipe them out. Grant didn't need to be told twice. Across the planet, humanity's forces moved with brutal efficiency. The Galish fought back with the desperation of a species that had never known true fear until now. Their armies fell, their war machines burned, and their leaders, once so confident in their dominance, were dragged from their underground bunkers and executed on live broadcast. The final act of the war was not a battle but a message. A single ship, smaller than the rest, was allowed to escape. It carried a recording of what had happened, a warning to every species in the galaxy. The message was simple: humanity had tried peace, now we brought war. The Galish were not extinct, not yet. Though their homeworld burned, though their armies lay in ruins, though their mighty fleets had been reduced to drifting debris fields, some still lived. The humans had let one ship escape, a deliberate mercy that was not mercy at all. It was a declaration, a challenge, a warning to all others who might think to test the species that had just annihilated a planetary civilization in a matter of days. But the Galish did not believe in surrender. They had ruled the stars for centuries, consuming and dominating as they pleased. They would not let themselves be wiped away by an upstart species from a backwater planet. Their remaining admirals scattered throughout the galaxy received the emergency signal and knew what had to be done. Survival meant war at deep space. Outpost near the fringes of the Oran. Arm served as their rally point here. The remnants of their military battered warships scattered battalions commanders, who had barely escaped aped the devastation gathered for the only response their pride would allow, a counterattack. They did not yet understand what they were up against. Admiral Nathan Carter stood aboard the bridge of the TFS Retribution, watching the latest intelligence reports scroll across the main display. The Galish weren't done yet. He had expected as much. No species built an empire that spanned 1,000 systems without a contingency plan analysis. He asked Colonel Ross, head of intelligence for the fleet, folded his arms as he studied the incoming data. They're regrouping. What's left of their military has gathered at a station in deep space, likely trying to form some kind of resistance. They still think they can win. Carter shook his head. That's what happens when you've never faced total annihilation before. They still believe they have options. Ross nodded. We could wait, let them make the first move, bait them into stretching themselves too thin. We could. Carter's eyes never left the display. Or we could do what we did before. Hit them first, hit them harder. A silence settled over the bridge. No one objected. They all knew what needed to be done. Send the order, Carter said. No half measures. We take their fleet, their station, and whatever is left of their leadership. When we're finished, there won't be a Galish resistance anymore. It took 3 days for the fleet to reach the outpost. The Galish had fortified it as best they could, building defensive lines, deploying their remaining warships in formation, preparing for the battle they hoped would turn the tide. They had numbers, but numbers wouldn't save them. The humans arrived with full force, and from the moment the first shots were fired, the outcome was never in doubt. Kinetic rounds shattered hulls. Rail guns tore through armored plating like it was paper. Swarms of missiles and drone fighters overwhelmed the Galish defenses, ripping apart their formations before they could even return fire effectively. On board the TFS Retribution, Carter watched the battle unfold in real time. The enemy's lines were breaking. Ships that had once been symbols of their empires might now burned in the voids. Some tried to flee. They never made it far. Bring us into range, Carter ordered. I want that station leveled. The fleet's heavy cannons charged, glowing with energy. The Galish had spent years constructing this outpost, reinforcing it with thick alloyed plating and defensive turrets. It wouldn't matter when the first wave of fire struck. Entire sections of the station erupted in flame. Secondary explosions followed, tearing through its structure like a chain reaction of destruction. Aboard the station, the remaining Galish leaders watched in horror. They had thought this would be their stronghold, their chance to turn things around. Instead, it had become their tomb. One last transmission escaped before the final explosion consumed the outpost. It was a simple, desperate message to any who remained. Run. The battle was over. The war was not. Carter leaned back in his chair as the reports rolled in. No survivors, no stragglers. The Galish fleet had been wiped out entirely. It had been a battle, but not a difficult one. They had been broken ever since the moment they made their mistake on their home world. They won't recover from this, Colonel Ross said. Carter wasn't so sure. They might try to disappear into the outer systems, spread themselves out, turn into raiders, mercenaries, stragglers. We don't stop until we're sure they're done for good. Understood, Ross replied. We'll track any remaining forces, sweep the remaining colonies, make sure there's nothing left. Carter nodded, but he wasn't satisfied yet. Humanity had sent a message, but he knew the galaxy was watching. There were other species, other empires. Some of them were surely debating their next move. They think we're monsters, Carter muttered. Ross gave him a sideways glance. Aren't we? Carter considered it for a moment. The Galish had eaten the ambassador in front of his own people, expecting submission. Instead, they had gotten extinction. He exhaled. We tried peace first. There were still Gal cash out there. Carter knew it. The war had shattered them, reduced their once great empire to little more than scattered remnants. But the survivors would not simply disappear. They would regroup in the shadows, waiting for a moment of weakness. If humanity wanted to finish what had been started, they had to hunt them down to the last nest status. Report, Carter said, eyes fixed on the hollow map. In front of him, Colonel Ross stepped forward. We're tracking several escape routes from the outpost. Before we destroyed it, most of their remaining forces scattered into deep space. We estimate no more than 2 or 3 war bands left, but they're still dangerous. They don't have a homeworld anymore. Carter muttered, no industry, no supply lines. They're running on whatever scraps they salvaged before we took them apart. Desperate enemies are often the most dangerous, Ross said. Cornered animals fight harder than we don't give them room to fight. Carter turned to the officers gathered around the command deck. We track every last one of them. We follow their movements, we cut off their escape, and we put an end to this. The fleet received its orders. Scout ship spread through the void, searching for signs of movement the Galish had left behind. No centralized command, no organized strategy. They were fragments of an empire, now isolated war bands, fleeing in different directions. Some sought refuge in the ruins of former colonies, hoping to hide until humanity's wrath passed. Others tried to turn into raiders, attacking isolated ships or remote stations in an attempt to cling to survival. It didn't matter. None of them would make it. The first major remnant was located in the Adaris system, a hidden shipyard deep within a nebula where a Galish admiral had gathered what was left of his fleet. The moment the Terran forces arrived, they tried to fight. It lasted minutes. Rail gunfire tore through their hulls before they could even get proper targeting solutions. The shipyard itself was wiped from existence, reduced to nothing but drifting wreckage. Another warband attempted to flee to the fringes of known space, hiding among asteroid fields. The humans tracked their energy signatures methodically, eliminating them one by one. There was no mercy, no hesitation. Carter observed it all from the bridge of the TFS. Retribution. It wasn't a war anymore. It was a systematic extermination, sir. Another transmission intercepted, Ross reported. Put it through. The voice that came through was chittering, the guttural clicks of the Galish, struggling to form coherent speech in the human language. Why do you he? Carter let the silence stretch for a moment before answering. Because you didn't stop. A pause, then a sound that might have been an attempt at laughter. We thought you were prey. The Galish voice rasped. You are worse than any predator. Carter gave a cold smile. You should have thought of that before you ate the ambassador. The transmission cut off minutes later. The last Galish vessel in that sector was reduced to debris. Reports kept coming in. More holdouts discovered, more remnants eradicated. Humanity wasn't leaving survivors. The Galish had made their choice, and now they would reap the consequences. But Carter knew this wasn't just about them anymore. Other species had watched this war unfold. Other civilizations had seen what happened when humanity was provoked. Some would be terrified. Others perhaps would be considering their own next moves. Ross approached, lowering his voice. Sir, we're getting word from the diplomatic corps. Some species are asking for official meetings. They want assurances of what that we won't do to them what we did to the Galish. Carter exhaled, glancing at the void beyond the bridge's viewport. Tell them the truth. And what truth is that? Carter turned to Ross, his expression unreadable. We tried peace first. The last of the Galish strongholds had been found deep within the Zaw's rift, in the shattered remain of an abandoned colony. The final remnants of their species had burrowed into the ruins, desperate to survive. They were no longer an empire, no longer warriors. They were fugitives, hiding in the dark, hoping that humanity would look away. Humanity did not look away. The TFS Retribution led the assault, accompanied by a fleet of warships. Hardened by the campaign, there was no grand battle, no desperate last stand. The Galish were broken before the first shot was fired. Their defenses were makeshift, their weapons scavenged from wreckage. They barely fought back. Some tried to flee. None escaped. When it was over, Carter stood in the ruins of what had once been a Galish city. His boots crunched over rubble as he surveyed the destruction. Smoke rose from the last stronghold, burning away the final remnants of their empire. Ross stood beside him, arms crossed. It's done, Carter. nodded. There was no satisfaction in the victory. Only a cold certainty the Galash had been wiped from existence, not because of revenge, not even because of strategy, but because humanity had learned a lesson. Long ago. You don't leave threats behind. Message from the Diplomatic Corps. Ross continued. Several species want treaties, alliances. They're falling over themselves to prove they mean no harm. Carter smirked. They're afraid, of course. They are. Ross gestured at the ruins. They just watched us wipe out an entire species. What do you expect? Carter turned away from the devastation, looking toward the sky where the human fleet hung in orbit. Then they finally understand, he said. We came in peace. We really did. Ross let out a short laugh. And when peace didn't work, Carter looked back at the ruins, then at the endless void beyond. We made sure war would never be an option. Again, the fleet pulled P out of orbit, leaving behind only silence. Humanity had spoken and the galaxy had listened.